How can you accelerate the launch of a startup through thought leadership? Today, I speak with Jody Padar, who built a brand as the Radical CPA. She's one of the very few CPAs who has built a brand, and Jody now serves as the head of tax strategy and evangelism at the fintech startup April. In this conversation, we're going to talk about thought leadership in startups. We'll explore how she was an early hire at April because of her thought leadership and how investors perceived her coming aboard. And we'll talk about tying thought leadership with go-to-market and revenue. I'm Bill Sherman, and you're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Jody.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So this gives us an opportunity to talk about topics that I've been excited to talk about, which is thought leadership in startups and thought leadership for growth, right? And you've done some amazing work. First, working with your own firm and using thought leadership as an accelerator, and now being the thought leadership expert and the voice of authority within startups. So my question for you, because I've heard it from other people, is if we're a small company, it's too early to be thinking about thought leadership because we're focused on customer acquisition, we're talking about go-to-market. Thought leadership is a nice to have rather than a need to have. What would you say to that?
I would argue that thought leadership is more important than all of those. And that's just me, because thought leadership brings you places you never thought you would go. It elevates you and your brand to places you never thought you'd be. And all those other things end up being kind of little when you see as to where thought leadership takes you, especially if you go at it from the perspective of coming at the topic from your voice and what's important to you, and not saying, oh, I'm creating thought leadership and, it becomes part of marketing, because real thought leadership is not part of marketing, even though it kind of falls under it. Real thought leadership comes from having an idea, sticking to it, and figuring out how that thought evolves over a period of time.
So that's a great answer, because I've got about 5 different follow-ups from it, okay? And so let's start digging in. So you said that thought leadership may be more important than sales and go-to-market and new customer acquisition, first customer acquisition in a startup. Let me play the role of a skeptic for a moment. Can you prove it? Can you tell me a story or give me an example of how thought leadership achieves those things that you were talking about? How has it worked for you?
So thought leadership, when it's connected to a person, right? Like it kind of creates this personal brand, whether you call it an influencer or thought leadership, I don't know. Like there's all different things of what it does to the person who is connected to their thoughts, right? And what happens is it's the law of attraction. So when you put that person in a startup or in a new company, or even if you're developing it, and it's like, you're just starting a brand new company, there's no thought leadership there, and you're the person who's kind of building it and creating it. What it does is it brings people to you, as opposed to you going to sell to them. They come to you, and it just becomes, how do we work together, instead of I'm selling you this or that, right? Like they want to work with you. And so it's never even a sales conversation. It's just like, how? And like, let's work together. And that's the thing that people don't get, that building whether you call it a personal brand or thought leadership or any of that, that's the force multiplier that people don't understand, because otherwise you're paying for marketing. You're paying to do things to get people to want to talk to you. And this is, people just come in and they talk to you all the time. And you're like, the things that come in your door are just so surprising, because you would have never in your wildest dreams thought that you could have such opportunities, and they walk in your door because of thought leadership.
So Jody, you built a reputation, brand, identity, thought leadership platform as the Radical CPA. Right. So how did that come to be? Did you wake up one morning and say, feeling radical today, I can stay with it? Let's explore that story for a little bit.
right? So I never set out to be a thought leader. I didn't even know that it existed. And basically what happened is about 15 years ago, things were changing in the accounting space. And I was on the bleeding edge and I was trying to figure things out. And the tools that I was getting weren't the tools that I needed. So there's these new cloud technologies and new software coming into play. And I was trying to figure out how to use it and how it would affect my clients in doing and working with them in different ways, and which has 15 years later evolved to be the status quo, like what everybody does now or what everybody's thinking about doing. When I was doing it, everybody thought I was crazy, that it was nuts. Why would you be doing such a thing? You know, I was always like, I don't want to say getting in trouble, but they were always looking at me like I was less than. And now, you know, they steal my ideas and they act like they're their own, right? And it's 15 years later. But what happens is you try to understand things. And so I started writing and I started blogging because it was so confused in my mind and there was no one who I could read about. No one was teaching it. Nobody was talking about it, right? So I started to write it to make clarity in my own head. And then I started, Twitter was just starting. So I started posting blogs on Accounting Today. And then I started tweeting about it and I started building this following. And what I found is even though a lot of people didn't believe in what I said, there was a very small following of people that were like, go Jody, you're right, they're wrong. And we were the outsiders at that point, but I was getting validated that the stuff that I was talking about was relevant and it did affect some people. And they helped me evolve my ideas and we kept evolving them. Fast forward about 7 years ago, my publisher came to me and said, you need to write the book and you need to write it now, because he saw the market and he saw how people were taking things that he knew that I was like known for and that they were my ideas. And he said, it's time to put them on paper. And like any good publisher, right? He wants to make money off of it. So he's watching the market and he's saying, oh, like now's the time to write the book because now is when I can sell the book, right? And so I wrote the book and I wanted to call it The Four Tenets of the New Firm. And he said, nobody's going to buy that book. And he said, we're going to call it The Radical CPA. And that's how I was branded The Radical CPA.
That's fantastic, right? So a couple things in there I want to call out. One, this journey started with you as a practitioner looking for better tools and ways of doing things, right?
Yes.
And going, the status quo, well, it kind of sucks, right? And looking for better ways, easier ways, more effective ways, right?
Better life. Ultimately, right. I wanted to make more money and work less. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
And with that, you talked about, you had the folks who believed in the vision and said, this is the way to get to work less, make more, right? But you also had those detractors, and there are the people who, you can love your critics if they're helping you refine the idea. And that's one of the things that I heard in there was the critics who said, well, that doesn't work because allowed you to make the idea sharper.
Yeah, 100%. Because if you were to look at the way I started too, I was very defensive what I was doing. And someone said to me, well, you know, they're not going to buy it if you don't open up to more of like discussion. And it was funny because I was so protective of what I was talking about. And I was like, oh, you're wrong. But what was when I started to let others in and help kind of evolve my thinking and make it bigger and stronger and everything, that's when it really started to spread because it wasn't so narrow-minded. And it's not that I was narrow-minded. It was just that idea was still a baby and it wasn't ready yet. Like it was still starting to like figure itself out and it needed outside sources to help it grow. I couldn't grow it by myself. And it was when I let everybody else in and really, I'll say, listened and evolved it, that's when, like they say, we started a movement. That's when the movement really started.
And I want to call something out here because I think this is an important part of the story. You were focused on a very narrow sort of topic. How do we create the new accounting firm, right? It's not relevant. It's not like management or leadership, right? You had a narrow niche of bringing technology and cloud, and now we'd be talking about multi-cloud and that sort of thing for
Pricing and
tech.
management and things.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
firm specific. If you weren't a
But yeah,
CPA firm, you wouldn't be interested.
right, exactly. But you built a large audience for this. And could you maybe in a broad brushstroke or two now talk about the size of audience that you've built talking about these
Well,
concepts?
sure. So you've heard too, riches are in niches, right? So like
Right.
anytime you niche something out, like you get rid of people, but you also bring the people who follow you in closer. So that's
Mm-hmm.
part of it, right? But it began with a few thousand. Well, I should say a few hundred on Twitter, a few thousand. Then it got to be like 15,000 on Twitter. And I was still writing for Accounting Today. And I did that religiously when everybody else, like I really did it every 2 weeks. So I kept it was more consistency than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took that and I took it to LinkedIn. And when LinkedIn first became as a publishing platform, I started posting a lot of my content that I had on Accounting Today on LinkedIn. And it turned out to be the most read and liked and shared accounting specific content on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn's algorithm said that she's someone to follow. So basically it boosted me. And it then, like if it said you wanted to follow someone on LinkedIn, it would put my head up for money and finance. And I won that award 2 years in a row. And in the process, it helped me gain almost 700,000 followers on LinkedIn. So, and the funny thing about them is they're all CPAs, controllers, CFOs, public accountants. There are a few people who don't belong in that niche, but the majority of people who follow me, and you can tell, are people who are in the financial industry, wealth management, right? Which is crazy because I have such a niched out following, which again makes it special because most people don't have such a highly specific audience.
Well, and I think of it in some ways like a radio station, right? People tune into the station
Right.
expecting a certain type of programming, right? And you built your lane, you shifted it through different modalities, whether it was writing and Accounting Today, putting it on Twitter, LinkedIn, but you saw orders of magnitude of growth by staying to that niche, right?
Right.
And what becomes important is not do you have 750 million followers on LinkedIn, because I don't know how to be relevant to 750 million people. Heck, even sometimes the thought of being relevant to 600,000 people, that's kind of daunting on its own in some ways, right? But to know who those people are that you're primarily talking to and say, this is what I'm talking about. If I'm for you, tune in. And if not, feel free to check out.
Right. And one of the interesting things about that is, remember, even though I was building this thought leadership platform, which I didn't know I was building because it was kind of like happening in the background, I was serving end users who were customers, who were regular small businesses who needed a CPA. So my thought leadership didn't even directly correlate to my person who I was selling to, right? Like a lot of people would say, oh, well, you're selling some sort of financial program to CPAs or something. No, I wasn't. I was selling small business accounting and tax work to regular small businesses. And my thought leadership was at the professional level. And what was funny about it is that thought leadership made it even more important for people to work with me because they wanted to work with the expert's expert. So they were like all in on the fact that I wasn't even talking about things that related to them, but that other CPAs were following me and other CPAs were listening to me, that made their CPA that much more special. And that's why they wanted to work with me. And I could command the prices that I did and kind of evolve my firm as well. Because everyone says, well, it doesn't even relate. Well, it doesn't, but it does.
Well, that layering of expertise of who follows you and do I trust that person, right? And there's a second order credentialing that happens on that.
Right.
I think where I want to turn now to, let's talk about your current work at April. So let's level set for a moment. What is April and how are you supporting April? with thought leadership?
So April is a new tax fintech. We're going to market through banks, but essentially we would be considered similar to TurboTax and an individual taxation program. However, you would obtain us through your bank, not necessarily direct to consumer. So we're not going through consumers, we're going through B2B to C. But we're essentially tax software. And we're going to bring to the market real-time tax planning, et cetera. There's lots of good things that are happening. We're a fairly new startup. We were funded in end of last year. We officially launched in January. And I was hired because of my thought leadership. And when I say because of, right, like there's all this other stuff of work that I do. I'm head of tax there. And I'm figuring out, and I'm technical. You have to remember, I still am a CPA at heart, and I still have that technical component to me. But when you have someone who brings with them thought leadership, it exponentially builds the April brand as well as my brand, right? So like they wanted me because it automatically gave them that authority, that specialness, that they got the best of the best in the accounting space. And from an investor standpoint, investors love that, right? Like it evaluates when we're trying to raise money, the investors love it. All of a sudden, again, it's bringing authority to where you are. And that means stuff walks in the door as opposed to you, again, going out to find it. And that's the thing that people don't understand is like stuff just comes in. Like I guess you can say I market indirectly because I keep up my thought leadership, but I never actually sell. Like I never try and sell. There's never a call to action. It's always just me being me. And yet stuff walks in the door and it's how do we do business together? Not if we're going to do business, it's how. And that's the difference.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. And from the investor's point of view, right? So for a fintech startup, one of the questions would be, okay, how are you acquiring customers? How are you getting subscribers and users to this service, right? Whereas if you say, I already have a following, I have people who will notice when I change my LinkedIn profile and say I'm now with April, they're going to ask, what's April?
Exactly. It's news, right? Like it's news in the accounting community when I switched jobs because it was like, well, who are they and how did they get her? And she's like, and it sounds so weird because it's like the best of the best, right? But that's what my brand says. And so then everyone's like, well, like it must be special because they got Jody. And it's funny to say that, but ultimately that's what thought leadership and personal branding does. I mean, at the end of the day, you're compared to someone who's known versus unknown. Guess who they pick? They pick the known quantity. And in some ways it's good, in some ways it's bad, right? Like, and there's nothing perfect about it, but like, you know, they're going to pick who has the following. And to me, obviously it's worked in my benefit, but that's why you want thought leadership. And that's why you want to be a thought leader.
So here's where I want to then ask this question. There are folks who are listening to this podcast who work inside organizations of various sizes. And they look and they say, okay, I've got subject matter expertise, which is sort of where you were when you started, right? How do I, as a subject matter expert, make that leap to thought leadership? What should I work on and do that will lead me on the first steps of the journey towards what you've accomplished?
So first of all, I think if you're inside an organization, it might be a little bit harder because I worked for myself when I started. And Absolutely. So everything I said was my own. It didn't matter. I didn't report to anyone. There was nothing that I had to get approved. Like, you know, I've been in an organization where before I would post anything on social, it had to be approved. Right. So like that, I get that. And I understand that I had kind of a leg up because I was my own company, my own entity when I started. So I don't want to dismiss that it's so easy, right? But it starts with putting yourself out there. And until you take that risk to say, I have an opinion, this is my opinion, and it's an opinion, it's not regurgitating what everybody else said. It's taking a stance on something and nuancing it enough that it's different so that people start to look at it. And you have to do it consistently. You have to do it repetitively. And soon enough, people start to say, oh, she thinks like this. And therefore, I think like this too, or I like the way she's thinking. What else can we explore together? How else can we evolve something together? But you have to have your own opinion, and you have to, it can't be just regurgitating what everybody else said, because otherwise that's not thought leadership, that's content marketing.
Absolutely agree. And the other thing on content marketing I would add is it's usually a call to action on
Right.
buy or move towards a buying decision, as opposed to thought leadership is education, discussion, and often relationship building, right?
100%. And you have to respond to your followers, right? Like, so now I don't respond as much as I used to, but when my followership was really small, those were my friends, my peers. I was always reacting. We were always connecting. They were helping me evolve my ideas. And you can't take for granted who your followers are, because nobody's a leader without followers. So unless you nurture your followers and you help them understand what you're thinking and you help them evolve their ideas, you're not going to be a leader, because obviously you can't be a leader without followers. So your followers are just as important, if not more important, than your thoughts.
Your early followers especially, right?
For sure.
Because it's hardest to get those early followers. Now, my question for you, you mentioned consistency, and you mentioned in terms of publishing bi-weekly with Accounting Today, but there's a through line of consistency through this entire story that you've been telling. How long have you been doing this now?
So probably close to 15 years. Okay. So yeah. And in the beginning, it wasn't, I didn't have 700,000 followers at the beginning.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But my question is, on this journey of 15 years, when was the moment you went from, hey, I'm kind of being stubborn and I'm going to talk about these things, to, wow, this is working. There's success here.
It took me too long. So I was probably 4 or 5 years in before I realized I could actually get paid for my thoughts, and that brands wanted to connect to me, and that I don't want to say sell my thoughts, but that people wanted my influence and they wanted to be connected to that. And I was very protective of it. And I still am very protective of my brand, because I've spent too long building it, too much time, too much sweat equity in it, that I'm not going to let any random person come put their thing on my feed and like try and monetize it. Right. But it took me a good 4 or 5 years, even before I thought that I could monetize it. And then I started to monetize it. And then that builds it, right? Because again, when you start working with brands, then they push it to their people, and it exponentially grows it, because now you're like co-branded, right? It's like Jody and ADP or Jody and whoever. And now those are two brands together. So it multiplies it. So I wish I would have thought about it sooner, but I didn't know any better, and nobody was doing it. Nobody even had social media. I was the person on social who everyone said, you can't give out tax advice on social. That's when I was on Twitter. It was 2008, 2009. And I wasn't even supposed to be on there. Like, everyone was telling me no. And so
that's where you put your profile and your resume. Why are you talking there? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And especially as a CPA, you can't give out tax advice. Oh, that's, against the regulation. So yeah, like, I wish I would have thought of it sooner, but whatever, you live and you learn. And and then it just continues to grow. And then at a certain point, my regular CPA firm kind of it was being run by my partner at the time. I just let her basically run it. And I created my own media company. And so then I split off and I had a media company. And then we were acquired by one startup. And then I kept my media company, and then I just left and I joined April about 6 months ago. But that acquisition was solely because of my thought leadership. They weren't buying my firm, they were buying me, and they were buying the brand that I'd built because they wanted access to my followers and to be able to sell, right? Because they had something to sell and they wanted to sell it to my team. And when I was acquired by them, and I still do, I 100% believe in the product. It was what was next. When you say what's radical, 15 years ago, it was cloud. Today, it's artificial intelligence, it's machine learning, it's what's next, right? And so it made sense that they would acquire me because everything that they were selling was everything that I was preaching about. It's kind of that what's next. So it made all the sense in the world.
So let's stay on the concept of acquisition for a moment. And I want to turn to the question of valuation because you implied it, right? To my knowledge, there isn't data out there yet that concretely shows that thought leadership creates a higher multiple on acquisition, that you can't line item the premium as to what the closing price is going to be. But from my perspective on anecdata, right, stories that I've heard, there is a premium and a multiple. I'd love to hear your perspective from the accounting side as to the thought leadership premium and acquisition.
Well, so here's the thing. It doesn't matter what you're selling. There's always a buyer and a seller, and there's always somewhat of negotiation. You can say value is in the eye of the beholder to start
who's
with,
willing to pay for what and who's willing to sell at what.
But what was interesting to me as I was starting to figure out that I wanted to sell my firm and I wanted to move on to something new, I had top 100 firms looking at my itty bitty firm, and they were looking at it because of me, right? And because of my brand. Whereas what other small firm does the top 100 like come to you to try and buy because they don't even know you exist if you don't have a brand and you don't have thought leadership. So I had competition, which was like, again, kind of crazy.
It's always good as a seller to have multiple buyers courting you.
To have people courting me, right?
Right.
And then I had this tech piece too, right? So, and I ended up going with the tech, but it was very obvious in our talks that they were buying me and that they were buying you can't say they were buying my audience, but they were buying my influence, if that makes sense. And yeah, I got more than probably your average firm would have gotten. So, and I had a really good attorney and I kept my brand outside the deal, which was probably the smartest thing I ever did. So that was like if you have a thought leadership like platform and you're selling something, make sure your thought leadership stays inside its own entity it's its own IP, and it should always be in its own IP. And yes, you come with it, but it should always be its own IP. And that's the best advice I could give to anyone is make sure your thought leadership stays with you in its own IP.
Well, you talked about having it a media company. I'm guessing that the thought leadership sits in the media company?
Yeah, it sits in my media company. Yeah.
So as we begin to wrap up, Jody, I want to ask you one last question. If you were to offer advice to someone who has deep subject expertise today and is looking to take the first step on the journey, what would be your recommendation? If you could give them one piece of advice from the journey you've taken.
Get a thick skin. Because you're going to have haters. And you're going to have love, like people are going to love you and people are going to hate you. And if they don't, you don't have real ideas, because if you're in the middle, then you're not thought leadership because you're not expanding someone. So, and you have to get used to being in the public eye, and you have to get used to being, and this sounds so weird, but I will be at accounting conferences and people will come up to me. And like I said, and my daughter laughs, right? Because we'll be like sitting in the lobby and I have my yoga pants on and my Kohl's t-shirt, and people will come up to me and be like, "Are you Jody Padar?" And like my daughter just laughs at me because like, what is this accounting rock star? Like it's kind of crazy, but like now people watch you and you then have to, like, as you get bigger, you no longer have the freedoms that you used to have. So there's good and bad with it, right? Like now you have other brands, and these other brands, what would they say if you said this? And so it becomes, I don't know. When I first started, it was all me and it was like really empowering. And now it's more of a business, which is not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. But you have to have that thick skin, because people are going to judge you. They're going to say things about you, and you just, it's the internet. So they're like, they hide behind things too. So you just have to be okay with it and, let it roll off you and know that you're making a difference. And I think what kept me going for 15 years is not all the time, but every now and then I'll get an email, I'll get a LinkedIn note, I'll get something that says, you changed my life. I did this because of you. I read your post. You told me to go take an analytics course. I did that. And now I'm on a new track. And when you get those emails, that's what makes you want to give back and continue doing it. It's not otherwise, that's the high, right? That's what gets you to continue to want to evolve and help your audience and really teach your followers what's going on, as opposed to, again, if you're really in it just for monetary reasons, I don't know, then it's not so fun. It's like, I don't know. It's just different.
So, and I think that's a great place to close. Thought leadership has a deep intrinsic reward component, but often you need to keep that thick skin to have those moments of joy, right? But when you get that email or that direct message and you realize you've made impact, that can make your day or a week.
Oh, 100%. And it makes you keep going. And it's hard to measure, right? So like we started at the beginning talking about measurable, like how do you measure that impact? And it's so hard to measure the impact, both in the value of the company, but also in what you do every day. And those are the things that are having impact, but are they measurable? It's hard. And that's the hardest thing about thought leadership too, is how do you, and for people who are in larger organizations, how do you make that transfer back to, your KPIs or what you're supposed to be doing in your day job, and say that this is actually having an impact. Now, there are smart leaders out there who get it and see it and know it and like they feel it, but there are lots of less than smart leaders out there who don't see it and they don't see the immediate return, and
or they're pressured for the short term, right?
What do you do?
And they're like, what
Correct.
are you doing
Or they're pressured
this week,
for the
this
short
month,
term.
this quarter? Yeah.
Correct. And then how do you feel? What is your value to the organization? How do you support it? And so that's, I think, the harder part about doing thought leadership in a larger organization when you're not the owner or you're not the CEO. So
Absolutely. And I'll close on this is, if you're not in a position where you have that agency yourself, look for someone in the organization who can be a champion, whether they're officially head of thought leadership in the organization and they can provide support, or someone in the organization who has enough gravitas that they can support the work that you're doing on taking ideas to scale. Jody, I really want to thank you. I know you and I could probably chat for another hour, but this has been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.